You think you know the Vikings? Horned helmets, longships, and warriors dying gloriously in battle? You think their world was simple, brutal, but straightforward? Well, prepare to have everything you believed completely shattered. Because the Vikings didn't just raid and pillage. They created a sexual culture so twisted, so systematically horrifying, that it makes modern nightmares look like children's fairy tales. Imagine waking up tomorrow in medieval Scandinavia. You're getting dressed for the day when your shirt tears slightly at the collar. No big deal, right? Wrong. That tiny rip just became legal grounds for your spouse to divorce you, seize all your property, and brand you as sexually deviant for the rest of your life. In Viking society, showing even a hint of chest hair could destroy everything you'd ever worked for. But that's just the beginning. The Vikings built an entire civilization on sexual terror that governed everything from poetry to warfare in ways that would make modern legal systems seem like playground rules. What I am about to reveal isn't the romanticized version taught in schools. This is the raw, unfiltered truth pulled directly from original law codes and eyewitness accounts about how our ancestors weaponized intimacy into a tool of social control. The mathematics of this horror are staggering. Archaeological evidence shows that in some Viking settlements, over 30% of the population lived as slaves. These weren't just workers, they were human property with zero legal protection, subject to systematic abuse that was not only legal but expected. The same culture that would execute a man for wearing the wrong clothing gave owners absolute sexual rights over their enslaved captives. Here's what most people don't realize about Viking sexual practices. They weren't random acts of barbarism. They were carefully codified systems with rules more complex than modern tax codes. The Vikings had specific laws governing which words could get you killed, which clothing violations justified divorce, and which sexual positions were legally required for valid marriages. They turned human intimacy into a bureaucratic nightmare where every gesture carried life or death consequences. But before we dive into the specific horrors, you need to understand the foundation that made all of this possible. The Vikings operated on a two-tier citizenship system based entirely on perceived sexual behavior. At the top sat the penetrators, men who maintained dominant sexual roles. At the bottom cowered the penetrated, anyone suspected of sexual passivity. And suspicion alone was enough to destroy everything. The word that could end your life was arger, roughly translating to unmanly or sexually passive. But its implications went far deeper than simple name-calling. When someone publicly called you arger, you had exactly three choices: kill your accuser immediately, accept total social death, or face outlawry where anyone could murder you without legal consequence. There was no fourth option, no appeal process, no way to prove innocence. The paranoia this created was suffocating. Men watched each other constantly, analyzing every gesture for signs of unmanliness. Did someone stand too close to another warrior? Did their voice crack during battle cries? Did they show too much emotion at a funeral? Any perceived softness could trigger accusations that ended in bloodshed. The legal text spelled out exactly which words demanded immediate violence. Argiar meant instant death. Strodin, meaning sexually used, carried the same penalty. Sordin, one who is penetrated, required immediate retaliation. These weren't insults. They were legal death sentences encoded in everyday language. And then came compound accusations that multiplied the horror. Call someone a gay-bearded arger, and you'd insulted both their masculinity and their age. That required double compensation, or double the bloodshed. The law codes from medieval Iceland contained 16 pages of sexual insults and their required violent responses, 16 pages of words that meant kill or be killed. The system was so effective because it made men police themselves. Warriors would murder their closest friends rather than let suspicions fester. The sagas record case after case of good men killing shield brothers over poorly chosen jokes. One saga tells of Thorstein murdering his cousin for mentioning he'd once worn a torn shirt that exposed his chest. The accusation didn't need to be true. Truth was irrelevant. Once spoken publicly, only blood could wash it away. Women weren't exempt from this madness, but their version worked differently. A woman calling another woman unmanly meant nothing. But accuse a woman of sexual availability, of enjoying intimacy too much, and that triggered the same violent responses. The sagas describe cases where single women had multiple men killed for suggesting they'd been friendly with traveling merchants. The psychological pressure was relentless. Vikings developed artificial behaviors to avoid suspicion. They practiced their walks to seem more masculine. They deepened their voices unnaturally. Some warriors deliberately scarred their faces to appear more violent, more safely masculine. Others grew beards specifically to avoid beardless insults that carried sexual implications. But here's where it gets truly insane. The same culture that would execute a man for perceived effeminacy celebrated gods who regularly engaged in the very behaviors they criminalized in humans. Take Loki, the shape-shifting trickster who routinely switched genders for sexual encounters. The stories every Viking child heard included Loki transforming into a female horse, mating with a stallion, and giving birth to an eight-legged foal that became Odin's mount. Think about that for a moment. The gods themselves engaged in cross-species gender-switching sexual encounters that produced monstrous offspring, and Vikings told these tales to children as a religious education. Thor himself dressed as a bride, complete with wedding dress and veil, to infiltrate enemy territory. Odin practiced what Vikings called feminine magic that required him to take passive sexual roles with spiritual entities. The chief god of Viking religion was, by their own legal definitions, Arguir. Yet mortals who imitated divine behavior faced immediate execution. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Gods could shapeshift, cross-dress, and engage in every form of sexual fluidity imaginable. That was divine mystery. Humans accidentally showing a collarbone-faced social annihilation. This paradox created impossible psychological pressure. Every Viking lived split between two realities: the fluid divine sexuality they worshipped and the rigid human sexuality that could kill them. They attended religious festivals celebrating Loki's horse pregnancy in the morning, then murdered someone for a soft gesture in the afternoon. The wedding rituals themselves embodied this contradiction. Every Viking marriage began with Thor's hammer placed between the bride's thighs, not symbolically, but literally. The actual ritual hammer, heavy enough to break bones, pressed against her body while witnesses chanted blessings. This wasn't subtle religious metaphor, it was the gods themselves blessing the union through symbolic divine penetration. But the hammer ceremony was just the beginning of wedding night horrors that make modern bachelor parties look tame. The entire wedding party followed the couple to their bedchamber, not to leave them alone but to participate. Witnesses would sing increasingly explicit songs about what the couple should do. They'd shout instructions and bang drums to establish rhythm while the sacred hammer remained on the bed, its presence making every act religiously mandated. The morning after brought fresh humiliation, as the bloodied sheets were displayed publicly for examination. The same witnesses who'd participated the night before would inspect the evidence, checking for appropriate blood quantity and proper staining patterns. Too little suggested the bride wasn't virgin. Too much implied violence. The sheets became legal documents stored for potential future court cases, and this was considered the civilized part of Viking sexual culture. Wait until you discover what happened in the slave markets of Dublin, where human beings were bought and sold with the same casual efficiency used for livestock. Where 30% of the population lived in chains, subject to systematic sexual abuse that was not only legal but expected. The mathematics of human trafficking were precisely calculated. A healthy male laborer cost 12 ounces of silver. A young woman suitable for household duties brought 15 ounces. Everyone understood what those household duties included. Children under 10 sold for 8 ounces, but only if they showed no physical defects. The inspection process was deliberately dehumanizing. Buyers would force slaves to run in place, checking stamina. They'd pull back lips to examine teeth like livestock. Women faced additional violations as buyers legally examined everything, often publicly, while discussing breeding potential with the casual tone used for discussing horse bloodlines. But the real horror began after purchase. Viking law gave owners absolute sexual rights over their human property. Not just permission, but expectation. A man who didn't use his female slaves was considered strange, possibly unmanly. The same culture that policed free citizens' sexuality to murderous extremes gave total license with enslaved people. These weren't hidden criminal activities happening in dark corners. This was the economic engine that powered Viking Dublin, where slave markets operated every morning except Sundays. The infrastructure required reveals the scale. Transportation networks spanning from Iceland to Constantinople, standardized pricing guides, bulk purchase discounts, and financing options for major buyers. The psychological torture went beyond physical abuse. Enslaved people had to watch their children sold away like cattle. They served at feasts where their captors joked about murdering their families. Some found themselves serving the very warriors who'd burned their villages and slaughtered their parents, forced to smile and pour ale for their families' killers. Female slaves faced specialized horrors. Beyond routine sexual abuse, they could be loaned to guests as hospitality gifts. Pregnancy meant either violent abortion or bearing children who'd be sold away. Some owners used slaves for public entertainment at feasts, forcing them to perform sexually for drunk warriors' amusement, while the community cheered. Even death offered no dignity. Slave bodies were disposed of like garbage in mass pits outside towns, unless their owner died first. Then came one final horror: being selected as grave goods, buried alive to serve in the afterlife. The volunteer system for this was particularly twisted, as slaves would actually compete for the honor, knowing it meant better treatment during their final days than they'd experienced in years of bondage. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how completely normalized this became. Archaeological evidence shows that entire Irish bloodlines vanished into Viking slave networks. Genetic studies reveal population bottlenecks in certain regions, corresponding directly to slave collection periods. The trauma is literally written in DNA and cultural memory, passed down through generations. And we're just getting started. Because the Vikings didn't stop at enslaving bodies. They perfected techniques for destroying souls while keeping their victims alive to suffer. The systematic psychological warfare they developed makes modern interrogation techniques look like gentle persuasion. The screams echoing from the ritual chamber weren't cries of pain. They were something far worse. They were the sounds of consciousness being systematically destroyed while keeping the body perfectly intact. The Vikings had discovered something that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. You can break a human mind without touching their flesh, and the results last far longer than any physical wound. Picture this scene from a Viking temple in 9th century Norway. A captured Saxon monk sits chained to a wooden chair, physically unharmed, but surrounded by instruments that chill the blood. Not torture devices in the traditional sense, but tools designed to attack the mind itself. Mirrors positioned to create disorienting reflections. Bells that ring at carefully calculated intervals to disrupt sleep patterns. Masks carved with faces that seem to shift and change in flickering torchlight. The Vikings called this process soul-breaking, and they'd refined it into a science that would impress modern interrogators. They understood that destroying someone's sense of reality was far more effective than destroying their body. A broken arm heals in weeks. A broken mind might never recover, and that's exactly what they wanted. The technique began with sensory manipulation that seems almost gentle compared to their other practices. Captives would be fed foods that tasted wrong, not poisoned, but somehow off in ways their minds couldn't process. Water that looked pure but carried unfamiliar minerals that created strange dreams. Bread made with grains that induced mild hallucinations, just enough to make prisoners question their own perceptions. Sleep became the primary weapon in this psychological arsenal. Vikings discovered that controlled sleep deprivation could break the strongest warriors faster than any physical torture. But they didn't simply keep prisoners awake. They created sleep schedules that followed no natural pattern, waking captives at random intervals, sometimes after minutes, sometimes after hours. Never long enough for proper rest, but never consistent enough for the mind to adapt. The genius lay in the unpredictability. Humans can endure almost anything if they can predict it, plan for it, mentally prepare. But when every moment brings potential interruption, when sleep becomes a luxury that might be snatched away at any second, the mind begins to fracture. Prisoners would beg for consistent torture schedules, anything predictable they could mentally prepare for. But the Vikings had studied their enemies too carefully to provide even that mercy. They'd observed that different cultures broke in different ways. Christian monks, accustomed to religious discipline, could endure structured hardship but crumbled when faced with complete chaos. Saxon warriors, trained for battle's brutal clarity, fell apart when confronted with subtle psychological manipulation. The treatment varied based on the prisoner's background, creating customized psychological attacks. For deeply religious captives, Vikings would stage blasphemous ceremonies just outside their cells, forcing them to hear sacred prayers being mocked and twisted. For warriors, they'd create sounds of battle that would suddenly stop, leaving the prisoner straining to hear what happened to their comrades, their imagination filling the silence with horrors worse than reality. Children received special attention in these psychological campaigns, not because Vikings showed them mercy, but because broken children became the most effective weapons against adult captives. Parents would hear their children's voices calling for help from other parts of the compound, never knowing if the sounds were real or carefully orchestrated deception. The Vikings documented their techniques with the same precision they applied to shipbuilding or metalwork. They kept records of which methods worked fastest on different personality types. They noted optimal timing for various psychological pressures. They even developed a crude rating system for measuring mental breakdown, tracking prisoners' progress from initial resistance to complete psychological collapse. One particularly effective technique involved false hope, carefully administered and then shattered. Prisoners would be told they were being released, allowed to prepare mentally for freedom, sometimes even taken partway home before being dragged back to captivity. The psychological impact of having hope destroyed was often more devastating than months of conventional abuse. But perhaps the most insidious aspect was how Vikings used prisoners' own moral codes against them. Christian captives would be forced to choose between betraying their faith or watching other prisoners suffer. Warriors would face decisions between personal honor and their comrades' safety. Every choice became a trap designed to make victims complicit in their own destruction. The long-term effects were exactly what Vikings intended. Prisoners who eventually gained freedom often couldn't readjust to normal life. They developed such severe paranoia that they couldn't trust their own perceptions. Many became convinced that their rescue was just another layer of deception, that they were still captives in an elaborate psychological maze. Some returned to their homelands only to discover they could no longer function in civilized society. They'd jump at unexpected sounds, refuse to sleep in enclosed spaces, and react with violence to harmless situations their damaged minds interpreted as threats. Their own families often couldn't recognize the broken shells that returned wearing familiar faces. The Vikings considered this the ultimate victory. They'd created weapons that would continue fighting long after the war ended. Former prisoners became walking advertisements for Viking psychological warfare, living proof that resistance was not only futile but actively harmful to one's sanity. But the true horror wasn't what they did to enemies. It was what they did to their own people who showed any sign of psychological weakness. Vikings who displayed what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress from battle faced immediate suspicion of unmanliness. Warriors returning from combat were expected to show no emotional distress, no difficulty sleeping, no reluctance to fight again. Those who couldn't hide their psychological wounds faced the same social destruction reserved for sexual deviants. A warrior who flinched at sudden sounds, who showed nervousness around weapons, who displayed any sign that violence had affected his mind, risked being branded as cowardly or effeminate. The treatment for battlefield trauma was often worse than the original traumatic experience. This created a feedback loop of psychological damage that poisoned entire communities. Men who'd been broken by combat had to hide their symptoms, often turning to alcohol or violence to maintain appearances of mental strength. Their untreated trauma manifested in domestic abuse, unpredictable rage, and increasingly desperate attempts to prove their masculinity remained intact. The effects rippled through families and communities for generations. Children raised by psychologically damaged fathers learned that emotional expression was dangerous, that vulnerability invited attack, that strength meant suppressing any sign of human feeling. They grew up to become adults who perpetuated the same cycles of psychological abuse they'd witnessed. Women in these communities developed their own survival strategies, learning to navigate the unpredictable moods of traumatized men while hiding their own emotional responses to constant threat. They became experts at reading microexpressions, anticipating violence, and protecting their children from fathers whose minds had been shattered by experiences they could never discuss. The medical understanding of psychological warfare that Vikings developed was centuries ahead of their time, but they used this knowledge purely for destruction. They could identify the precise pressure points of human consciousness, the exact techniques needed to shatter specific personality types, the optimal timing for maximum psychological damage. Modern interrogation experts studying Viking techniques are often shocked by their sophistication. These weren't crude barbarians stumbling onto effective methods. They were systematic researchers who documented, refined, and perfected psychological torture with scientific precision. Their understanding of human psychology was disturbingly advanced, applied with ruthless efficiency to break their enemies' minds. The legacy of these techniques extended far beyond individual victims. Entire cultures learned to fear Viking psychological warfare more than their physical violence. Communities would surrender rather than risk having their leaders subjected to soul-breaking techniques that would leave them alive but mentally destroyed, unable to function as effective rulers. But even these psychological horrors pale compared to what happened when Vikings combined mental manipulation with their most twisted religious practices. Because they didn't just break minds for tactical advantage, they incorporated psychological torture into their most sacred rituals, creating ceremonies where destroying human consciousness became an act of worship that supposedly pleased their gods. The temple drums began at sunset, their rhythm designed to synchronize with human heartbeats and slowly accelerate beyond what the body could naturally follow. By midnight, captives would be gasping for breath as their cardiovascular systems tried to match the impossible tempo. But this wasn't the warm-up. This was just preparation for what Vikings called the sacred unmaking, a religious ceremony where psychological destruction became divine worship. Picture the scene inside a Norwegian temple circa 850 AD. Captured enemies, already weakened by weeks of soul-breaking techniques, are brought before an altar carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The priests haven't just studied psychological warfare. They've weaponized it into religious practice, creating rituals where breaking human minds becomes an offering to gods who supposedly feast on shattered consciousness. The ceremony begins with what appears to be mercy. Prisoners are given food, clean clothes, even allowed to wash. For the first time in weeks, they experience basic human dignity. Their guards speak kindly, offer comfort, suggest that perhaps their ordeal is ending. Hope, carefully cultivated, becomes the trap that makes everything that follows exponentially more devastating. But here's where Viking religious psychology reaches levels of sophistication that make modern cults look amateur. The priests don't just break down their victims randomly. They've identified specific spiritual beliefs that each prisoner holds dear, then systematically corrupt those beliefs until faith itself becomes a source of torment rather than comfort. Christian captives face perverted versions of their own religious ceremonies. Vikings stage mock baptisms using blood instead of water, forcing prisoners to watch their sacred rituals transformed into blasphemous theater. They recite corrupted prayers that sound almost correct, but contain subtle changes that make devout Christians physically ill to hear. The familiar becomes horrifyingly unfamiliar, destroying the mental anchors that prisoners use to maintain sanity. For pagan captives from other cultures, Vikings employed different techniques. They'll claim to worship the same gods but perform rituals so twisted that prisoners can't reconcile what they're seeing with their own religious understanding. Sacred symbols are displayed upside down or combined in ways that create cognitive dissonance so severe it causes actual physical symptoms. The genius of this approach lies in how it attacks identity at the deepest level. Religion isn't just belief for these prisoners. It's the foundation of who they are, how they understand reality, their connection to something greater than themselves. When that foundation crumbles, everything else collapses with it. The priests document each prisoner's breaking point with clinical precision. They note which corrupted prayers cause the strongest reactions, which blasphemous ceremonies trigger the most psychological distress, which combinations of religious violation and physical discomfort produce optimal results. They're conducting research using human souls as laboratory specimens. But the truly horrific aspect is how Vikings integrate sexual humiliation into these religious ceremonies. Prisoners are forced to participate in rituals that violate every concept of sexual propriety their cultures hold sacred. Not through physical assault, but through psychological manipulation that makes victims complicit in their own degradation. They might be told that refusing to perform certain acts will result in their family members suffering worse fates, or that participation will earn mercy for their fellow prisoners. Every choice becomes impossible, every decision a betrayal of either personal dignity or concern for others. The psychological trap is perfect because there's no way to maintain moral integrity, regardless of what the prisoner chooses. The audience for these ceremonies includes Viking children, who are taught to view the proceedings as normal religious observance. They learn that destroying enemy consciousness is holy work, that psychological torture serves divine purposes, that human suffering can be transformed into spiritual nourishment for their gods. These children grow up with fundamentally altered concepts of empathy and morality. They've witnessed systematic psychological destruction presented as religious duty, watched adults they respect turn human torment into worship, learned that consciousness itself can be a weapon to be wielded against enemies. The ripple effects spread through entire generations. Children raised on these ceremonies become adults who view psychological manipulation as natural, even virtuous when applied to enemies. They develop sophisticated techniques for identifying and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in others, skills they pass on to their own children as survival necessities. But the religious justification makes everything worse because it removes moral constraints that might otherwise limit the cruelty. When psychological torture becomes divine service, when breaking minds is reframed as holy work, there's no natural stopping point. The more suffering inflicted, the greater the supposed spiritual benefit. Vikings develop increasingly elaborate ceremonies as communities compete to demonstrate their religious devotion through more creative forms of psychological destruction. What begins as simple mind-breaking evolves into theatrical productions, where human consciousness is systematically dismantled for entertainment value disguised as worship. The priests themselves undergo changes that make them more effective at their grisly work. Constant exposure to extreme psychological manipulation alters their own mental states, making them less capable of normal human empathy, while enhancing their ability to identify and exploit psychological weaknesses in others. They develop what modern psychologists would recognize as antisocial personality traits. But within Viking culture, these changes are viewed as spiritual advancement. Priests who can destroy minds most efficiently are considered closest to their gods, most blessed with divine favor, most worthy of community respect and authority. The training process for these religious positions involves systematic desensitization to human suffering that would horrify modern mental health professionals. Aspiring priests are gradually exposed to increasing levels of psychological cruelty until they can participate without emotional reaction, their natural empathy systematically destroyed through carefully controlled exposure therapy. But even more disturbing is how these techniques spread beyond religious contexts into everyday Viking society. The psychological manipulation methods developed for sacred ceremonies begin appearing in legal proceedings, business negotiations, and domestic disputes. Entire communities become skilled at identifying and exploiting each other's mental vulnerabilities. Marriage negotiations involve psychological profiling to determine which manipulation techniques will be most effective against potential spouses. Business partnerships include assessments of psychological breaking points to ensure advantages in future disputes. Even children's games incorporate elements of mental manipulation as training for adult social interactions. The line between religious ceremony and daily life dissolves until psychological warfare becomes the default mode of human interaction. Vikings don't just use these techniques against enemies. They employ them against neighbors, family members, anyone whose behavior they want to control or whose resources they want to access. Women in this environment develop extraordinary skills at psychological self-defense, learning to identify manipulation attempts, deflect mental attacks, and protect their children from community members who view psychological domination as normal social interaction. But these defensive skills come at enormous personal cost. Living in constant psychological warfare takes a toll that manifests in ways Vikings don't fully understand. Communities experience epidemic levels of what modern medicine would recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, and complex trauma responses. But Viking culture interprets these symptoms as character flaws rather than predictable responses to systematic psychological abuse. The cumulative effect creates societies where genuine human connection becomes nearly impossible. When everyone is trained to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities, when mental manipulation is normalized as standard social interaction, when consciousness itself is viewed as a battleground, authentic relationships can't develop. Trust becomes a luxury too dangerous to afford. Emotional vulnerability transforms into tactical disadvantage. Love itself gets weaponized as manipulation technique rather than experienced as genuine connection. Entire generations grow up without ever experiencing healthy human relationships because their culture has poisoned the psychological foundations that make such relationships possible. But this systematic destruction of human psychological well-being was just preparation for Viking society's most twisted innovation. Because they didn't stop at breaking individual minds or corrupting community relationships. They developed methods for destroying entire cultures from within, psychological warfare techniques designed to make conquered peoples complicit in their own cultural extinction. The process begins subtly, almost benevolently. Viking conquerors arrive not with immediate violence but with offerings of trade, cultural exchange, and mutual cooperation. They study conquered peoples carefully, identifying the core beliefs, values, and traditions that hold these cultures together. Then they begin the slow work of corruption from within. Sacred traditions get modified in small ways that seem insignificant but fundamentally alter their meaning. Religious ceremonies are preserved but performed with slight changes that gradually drain them of spiritual power. Cultural heroes are celebrated, but their stories are retold with subtle modifications that transform inspiring figures into cautionary tales. The genius lies in making conquered peoples active participants in their own cultural destruction. Vikings don't simply impose their values through force. They manipulate existing cultural structures until native populations voluntarily abandon their own traditions in favor of Viking alternatives that seem more practical, more powerful, more aligned with changed circumstances. Children become the primary targets because they're most susceptible to cultural manipulation and will eventually become adults who pass altered traditions to their own offspring. Viking educators present themselves as helpful teachers offering valuable skills, but their lessons systematically undermine the psychological foundations of native cultures. Language becomes a weapon in this cultural warfare. Vikings don't forbid native languages, but gradually introduce Norse words and concepts that don't translate cleanly, forcing speakers to adopt Viking mental frameworks to express ideas their own languages can't accommodate. Over generations, thought itself becomes colonized as vocabulary shapes consciousness. Religious beliefs face similar manipulation as Vikings identify compatible elements in native faiths and slowly merge them with Norse mythology until conquered peoples find themselves worshipping Viking gods without realizing how their beliefs have been transformed. The familiar gradually becomes foreign while the foreign becomes familiar. Marriage practices provide another avenue for cultural destruction as Vikings intermarry with conquered populations, but always on terms that favor Norse customs over native traditions. Children of these unions grow up bicultural, but with Viking practices positioned as superior, more sophisticated, more connected to power and success. The psychological impact compounds across generations until conquered peoples find themselves culturally adrift, no longer fully connected to ancestral traditions, but never completely accepted into Viking society either. They exist in psychological limbo, belonging fully to neither culture while serving Viking interests through their displaced loyalty. This cultural destruction proves more effective than simple military conquest because it creates conquered peoples who willingly serve Viking interests, believing they're making free choices rather than recognizing how their decision-making processes have been systematically manipulated to favor outcomes that benefit their conquerors. The techniques are so sophisticated that many victims never realize they've been psychologically conquered until it's too late to recover their original cultural identity. By then, the knowledge necessary to reconstruct authentic traditions has been lost, replaced by Viking-influenced alternatives that masquerade as ancient wisdom while serving contemporary political purposes. But even this cultural psychological warfare was merely the foundation for Viking society's most horrifying achievement: the systematic transformation of human sexuality into a weapon of social control so sophisticated that it makes modern propaganda campaigns look like amateur hour. Because Vikings didn't just conquer bodies and minds, they conquered the very concept of intimacy itself. The transformation began in childhood, long before Vikings understood what was happening to them. Picture a 6-year-old Norse child watching their first wedding ceremony, absorbing lessons that would shape their entire understanding of human intimacy. They're not just witnessing a celebration, they're receiving their first education in how sexuality serves as the ultimate tool of social control. The child watches as the bride's family negotiates not just dowry amounts, but specific sexual obligations that will govern the marriage. They hear relatives discussing consummation requirements with the same casual tone used for planning harvest schedules. They observe how wedding guests openly debate the couple's expected performance, treating intimate human connection as community entertainment. But here's where Viking sexual conditioning becomes truly insidious. These children don't learn about sexuality through gradual discovery or gentle guidance. They're immediately immersed in a system where every aspect of intimate behavior carries legal, social, and religious consequences. Sex isn't presented as natural human expression, but as a battlefield where victory means survival and defeat means social annihilation. The educational process is relentless and systematic. Children learn to categorize every human interaction through sexual hierarchies. They discover that showing emotion makes you vulnerable to accusations of effeminacy. They understand that physical affection between same-gender friends requires careful management to avoid deadly suspicions. They absorb the lesson that intimacy itself is dangerous unless performed according to rigid community standards. By adolescence, these children have internalized sexual paranoia so completely that it becomes their default mode of social interaction. They've learned to analyze every gesture for sexual implications, to interpret every word through frameworks of dominance and submission, to view human connection primarily as opportunity for exploitation or vulnerability to attack. The psychological damage compounds as they mature because Vikings never experienced sexuality as private, personal exploration. Every intimate encounter carries the weight of community judgment, legal consequences, and potential violence. Young people approach their first sexual experiences not with curiosity or affection, but with terror of performing incorrectly and facing social destruction. Marriage becomes the ultimate test of this conditioning. Newlyweds don't just commit to each other, but to performing their relationship for constant community scrutiny. Their sexual adequacy will be evaluated by witnesses, discussed at public gatherings, and used as evidence in potential future legal proceedings. Privacy doesn't exist because the community has collective ownership of every couple's intimate life. The wedding night witness requirements reveal how completely Vikings had weaponized sexuality. It's not enough for couples to consummate their marriage. They must do so in ways that satisfy community observers who will testify about their performance. The pressure transforms what should be intimate connection into theatrical production, where bad reviews carry devastating consequences. But the real genius of Viking sexual control lies in how it makes people police themselves. Once individuals understand that any aspect of their intimate behavior might be scrutinized, analyzed, and used against them, they begin monitoring their own thoughts and feelings with obsessive intensity. Self-censorship becomes automatic as people learn to suppress any sexual impulse that might invite community judgment. This internal surveillance system proves more effective than external enforcement because it operates constantly. Vikings don't just modify their behavior when others are watching. They alter their fundamental relationship with their own sexuality, treating natural impulses as potential threats to survival rather than normal human experiences. The psychological mechanisms involved would fascinate modern researchers studying social control techniques. Vikings discovered that sexuality provides the perfect leverage point for manipulating human behavior because it's simultaneously universal and deeply personal. Everyone has sexual feelings, but those feelings become weapons when subjected to community regulation. The system creates what psychologists would recognize as learned helplessness on a massive scale. When any sexual expression might trigger accusations that destroy your life, the safest strategy becomes complete suppression of sexual agency. People learn to accept whatever sexual role the community assigns them, rather than risk asserting personal preferences that might violate social expectations. Women face particularly sophisticated forms of sexual conditioning that transform them into active participants in their own oppression. They learn that their value depends entirely on managing sexuality according to community standards. Too much interest makes them scandalous. Too little makes them defective. They must calibrate their responses with precision that would challenge professional performers. The training process for young women involves constant surveillance of their developing sexuality by older female relatives who have internalized the same oppressive standards. Mothers teach daughters to suppress natural responses, fake appropriate ones, and navigate the impossible balance between availability and purity that Viking society demands. But perhaps most disturbing is how this conditioning affects children born into the system. They never experience sexuality as anything other than social performance. Their first understanding of intimacy comes through frameworks of dominance, submission, community judgment, and potential violence. They literally don't know that healthy sexual relationships are possible. The intergenerational transmission of sexual trauma becomes automatic as each generation passes damaged concepts of intimacy to their offspring. Parents who've never experienced healthy sexuality can't model it for their children. Communities that treat intimacy as warfare can't create environments where a genuine connection develops. The cumulative effect produces societies where authentic human bonding becomes nearly impossible. When sexuality is weaponized, when intimacy is performance, when connection is competition, the psychological foundations for healthy relationships simply don't exist. People learn to interact through power dynamics rather than mutual affection or genuine attraction. Archaeological evidence reveals the devastating consequences of this systematic sexual conditioning. Skeletal remains show patterns of stress-related health problems that correlate with the social pressures Viking sexual systems created. Genetic studies reveal population bottlenecks suggesting that many people simply couldn't or wouldn't reproduce under such psychologically damaging conditions. The documentary evidence is equally disturbing. Legal codes contain thousands of regulations governing sexual behavior, but virtually no provisions for protecting individual autonomy or promoting healthy relationships. The system was designed to control behavior, not support human flourishing, and its effects were exactly what you'd expect from such priorities. Modern scholars studying Viking sexuality often focus on the dramatic aspects like blood eagles and slave markets, but the subtle psychological conditioning may have been even more destructive because it affected everyone. Even free Vikings with high social status lived under constant sexual surveillance that poisoned their most intimate relationships. The conditioning techniques were so effective that they persisted long after Viking political power collapsed. Communities that had been subjected to Norse sexual control continued practicing modified versions of these systems for generations, unable to imagine alternatives to the psychological frameworks they'd learned. But the most chilling aspect isn't how Vikings controlled sexuality in their own communities. It's how they exported these techniques to conquered territories, using sexual conditioning as a colonization method that proved more effective than military occupation alone. Because once you control how people think about intimacy, you control the psychological foundations of their entire culture. The process begins with careful observation of native sexual customs, identifying which practices hold communities together and which create vulnerability to manipulation. Vikings study marriage rituals, courtship traditions, and family structures with the same attention they give to military defenses, looking for leverage points where sexual pressure might fracture social cohesion. They don't immediately impose Norse sexual standards on conquered peoples. Instead, they introduce modifications that seem minor, but fundamentally alter the psychological dynamics of intimate relationships. A marriage ceremony might be preserved but performed with slight changes that gradually shift power balances between spouses. Religious sexual practices face similar manipulation, as Vikings identify sacred elements in native traditions and slowly corrupt them through seemingly respectful integration with Norse customs. Over time, conquered peoples find themselves practicing sexuality that serves Viking interests while believing they're maintaining ancestral traditions. The genius lies in making cultural destruction feel like cultural preservation. Native communities cooperate with their own sexual colonization because Vikings present changes as enhancements rather than replacements, improvements rather than impositions, evolution rather than revolution. Children become primary targets because they're most susceptible to sexual conditioning and will eventually become adults who raise their own offspring according to modified standards. Viking educators present themselves as helpful teachers offering valuable knowledge about sexuality, but their lessons systematically undermine native concepts of healthy, intimate relationships. Language plays a crucial role as Vikings introduce Norse sexual terminology that doesn't translate cleanly into native tongues, forcing speakers to adopt Viking conceptual frameworks to discuss intimacy. Over generations, the very vocabulary of sexuality becomes colonized as the words shape thoughts about human connection. The psychological impact compounds across generations until conquered peoples find themselves sexually adrift, no longer connected to ancestral wisdom about intimacy, but never fully accepted into Viking sexual culture either. They exist in psychological limbo, practicing sexuality that serves their conquerors' interests while believing they're making autonomous choices. This sexual colonization proves devastatingly effective because it attacks the most fundamental aspects of human experience. When you control how people think about intimacy, reproduction, and family formation, you control the mechanisms through which cultures perpetuate themselves across generations. The techniques are so sophisticated that many victims never realize their sexual autonomy has been systematically destroyed until it's too late to recover authentic traditions. By then, the knowledge necessary to reconstruct healthy sexual practices has been lost, replaced by Viking-influenced alternatives that masquerade as ancient wisdom. But even this cultural sexual warfare was merely preparation for Viking society's ultimate achievement in human manipulation: the complete transformation of religious experience into psychological weapon. Because they discovered that when you control people's relationship with the divine, you control everything else about their existence. The final piece of Viking sexual control was perhaps their most diabolical achievement: turning the gods themselves into weapons of psychological warfare. They didn't just worship divine beings, they transformed religious experience into the ultimate tool for sexual manipulation, creating a system where your relationship with the gods determined every aspect of your intimate life. Picture this scene from a temple in 10th century Iceland. A young woman named Sigrid stands before an altar not for worship, but for what Vikings called divine sexual judgment. Her husband has accused her of inadequate performance in bed, and rather than face divorce proceedings, she's chosen to undergo religious trial by ordeal. The priest will determine whether the gods approve of her sexuality by subjecting her to ritualized humiliation disguised as sacred ceremony. This wasn't unusual. Vikings had developed an entire religious framework for regulating sexuality through supposed divine will. They claimed their gods demanded specific sexual behaviors from mortals, and any deviation from these requirements invited supernatural punishment that would destroy individuals, families, and entire communities. The religious sexual regulations were impossibly complex and deliberately contradictory. The fertility god Freyr demanded aggressive sexual pursuit from his male followers, while the war god Tyr required sexual restraint that bordered on celibacy. Odin expected his worshippers to demonstrate sexual dominance, while Frigg demanded they show sexual submission. No one could satisfy all divine requirements simultaneously, which gave priests unlimited power to find religious justification for punishing anyone's sexual behavior. The genius of this system lay in how it made people seek their own sexual oppression. Rather than having standards imposed by force, Vikings voluntarily submitted to increasingly restrictive religious requirements because they believed divine approval depended on sexual compliance. They policed their own intimate behavior more thoroughly than any external authority could manage. The priests who administered these religious sexual controls underwent training that would horrify modern religious leaders. They learned to identify psychological vulnerabilities in their congregants, exploit sexual anxieties for community control, and use religious authority to justify interventions in the most private aspects of people's lives. Their theological education was essentially a curriculum in systematic sexual manipulation. But the most disturbing aspect was how Vikings integrated child sexuality into their religious practices. Young people weren't protected from adult sexual expectations, but were subjected to religious evaluation of their developing intimate behavior from early adolescence. Priests claimed divine authority to examine, judge, and control children's sexual development in ways that modern societies would recognize as systematic abuse. The religious festivals became showcases for this sacred sexual control. Communities would gather not just to honor the gods, but to participate in collective sexual regulation disguised as worship. Public ceremonies included evaluation of couples' sexual performance, judgment of individuals' sexual adequacy, and ritualized punishment of those whose intimate behavior supposedly offended divine standards. These festivals created an atmosphere where sexual violence became religious duty. The same communities that would execute a man for wearing torn clothing would participate enthusiastically in ritualized sexual assault presented as divine service. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but religious framework made it psychologically manageable for participants. The long-term psychological effects were exactly what you'd expect from systematically weaponizing religious experience. Vikings developed pathological relationships with both sexuality and spirituality that poisoned every aspect of their emotional lives. They couldn't experience genuine intimacy because it was always filtered through religious judgment, and they couldn't experience authentic spirituality because it was always contaminated by sexual control. Archaeological evidence reveals the devastating consequences. Burial sites from Viking territories show patterns of stress-related health problems, premature mortality, and reproductive dysfunction that correlate directly with periods of intensive religious sexual regulation. The system literally killed people through psychological pressure. The documentary evidence is equally damning. Religious texts from the period contain detailed instructions for sexual surveillance, elaborate procedures for religious sexual punishment, and theological justifications for community intervention in private, intimate relationships. These weren't aberrations, but core elements of Viking religious practice. Modern scholars often struggle to comprehend how Vikings could simultaneously celebrate divine sexual fluidity while brutally punishing human sexual expression. The answer lies in understanding that they weren't trying to create consistent moral systems. They were developing tools for social control that used religious authority to justify unlimited interference in people's most private experiences. The techniques they developed were so effective that they influenced European sexual culture for centuries after Viking political power collapsed. Medieval Christianity adopted modified versions of Norse religious sexual regulation, creating institutional frameworks that controlled intimate behavior through claimed divine authority rather than secular law. But perhaps the most chilling legacy is how completely Vikings succeeded in normalizing the weaponization of human sexuality. They demonstrated that entire societies could be trained to view intimate relationships primarily as opportunities for social control rather than personal fulfillment, and their example has been studied and replicated by authoritarian movements throughout history. The mathematics of this horror are staggering when you consider the full scope. Over 3 centuries, Viking sexual control systems affected millions of people across territories spanning from Greenland to Russia. Archaeological evidence suggests that in some regions, up to 60% of the population showed signs of chronic stress-related health problems directly attributable to living under systematic sexual surveillance and control. The ripple effects extended far beyond immediate victims. Children raised in communities where sexuality was weaponized grew up to become adults who couldn't imagine healthy, intimate relationships. They passed damaged concepts of human connection to their own offspring, creating intergenerational cycles of sexual dysfunction that persisted for centuries. Even today, researchers studying Viking culture uncover new evidence of just how thoroughly they had corrupted human sexuality. Recent archaeological discoveries include specialized buildings designed for sexual surveillance, elaborate record-keeping systems for tracking community members' intimate behavior, and ritual objects used in ceremonies where sexual punishment was presented as religious worship. The technology they developed for sexual control was remarkably sophisticated. They created acoustic systems for eavesdropping on private conversations, architectural features for spying on intimate encounters, and even early forms of psychological testing designed to identify sexual nonconformity before it could threaten community control. But the most disturbing realization isn't what Vikings did to their enemies or their slaves. It's what they did to themselves. The system they created to control others eventually consumed them as well. By the end of the Viking Age, their own communities were so thoroughly poisoned by sexual paranoia that healthy relationships had become virtually impossible, even among the ruling classes. The collapse of Viking civilization can be directly attributed to their sexual control systems. When intimacy becomes warfare, when families become battlegrounds, when human connection is transformed into social control, societies lose the psychological foundations necessary for long-term survival. The Vikings literally destroyed themselves through their own sexual innovations. The lesson for modern audiences couldn't be clearer. Viking sexual practices weren't ancient barbarism safely confined to history books. They were sophisticated techniques for human control that continue to influence how we think about sexuality, relationships, and social regulation. Understanding their methods helps us recognize when similar patterns emerge in contemporary cultures. The most important realization is that the Vikings weren't uniquely evil. They were ordinary humans who developed extraordinary methods for weaponizing the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Their techniques succeeded because they exploited universal psychological vulnerabilities that exist in every society. The capacity for similar systematic sexual control exists wherever humans create communities, and vigilance against such systems requires constant effort. The archaeological record continues to reveal new evidence of Viking sexual practices that challenge our understanding of both their civilization and human nature itself. Each discovery forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what ordinary people can be convinced to do when sexuality becomes a tool of social control rather than an expression of human connection. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of studying Viking sexual culture is recognizing elements of their system in our own world. The techniques they pioneered for sexual surveillance, the methods they developed for weaponizing intimacy, the psychological frameworks they created for controlling human relationships. All of these innovations continue to influence modern societies in ways we're only beginning to understand. The Vikings proved that human sexuality could be completely corrupted and transformed into a weapon of social destruction. They demonstrated that entire civilizations could be built on systematic sexual control, without most participants recognizing what was happening to them. And they showed that once such systems take hold, they become self-perpetuating cycles that destroy the very societies that create them. Their legacy serves as both warning and instruction manual. Warning about what happens when sexuality is weaponized, and instruction manual for recognizing the early signs of such weaponization in our own communities. Because the Vikings weren't ancient monsters safely contained in history, they were humans like us, who made choices that led them down paths of systematic sexual control that ultimately destroyed everything they claimed to be protecting. Today, we can walk away from toxic relationships. We can choose our partners, set boundaries, protect our children from harmful traditions. We have legal systems that recognize individual autonomy, therapeutic resources for healing trauma, and social movements that challenge oppressive practices. These freedoms didn't emerge naturally. They were fought for by people who understood the alternative. The Vikings created the perfect case study in what happens when human sexuality becomes a weapon of mass social control. Their techniques were so effective that echoes persist in modern authoritarian movements, religious extremism, and systems of oppression that continue to plague societies worldwide. But their ultimate failure proves that such systems contain the seeds of their own destruction. When you turn love into warfare, you don't just destroy individuals, you destroy the social bonds that hold civilizations together. When intimacy becomes performance, communities lose their capacity for genuine human connection. When sexuality is weaponized, societies become too psychologically damaged to reproduce themselves across generations. The archaeological evidence tells the final chapter of this story. Viking settlements from the later period show dramatic population declines, increased infant mortality, and skeletal evidence of widespread stress-related disorders. Communities that had thrived for centuries began collapsing not from external invasion, but from internal psychological breakdown. Their sexual control systems had become so toxic that people simply stopped participating in the basic social functions necessary for civilization. Marriage rates plummeted. Birth rates collapsed. Young people fled to other societies where human connection was still possible. The Vikings had created a culture so hostile to healthy relationships that it literally bred itself out of existence. But here's the truly sobering realization. The Vikings weren't uniquely capable of such systematic horror. They were ordinary humans who made incremental choices that led to extraordinary cruelty. Every technique they developed, every control mechanism they perfected, every psychological weapon they created, started with small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. That's the real lesson of Viking sexual practices. They show us how quickly and completely human sexuality can be corrupted when communities prioritize control over connection, fear over love, power over partnership. They demonstrate that the capacity for such systematic abuse exists in every society, waiting to emerge whenever we allow collective fear to override individual dignity. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance against the Viking impulse that lives within every human community. The impulse to control rather than trust, to dominate rather than cooperate, to weaponize rather than celebrate the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Their story serves as both warning and inspiration. Warning about what we're capable of becoming, and inspiration to choose a different path. So the next time you hear someone argue that we need more social control over sexuality, remember the Vikings. The next time someone suggests that individual freedom must be sacrificed for community order, think about those empty longhouses and silent burial grounds. The next time anyone claims that systematic oppression serves a greater good, consider the civilization that destroyed itself through the very controls it claimed would make it strong. The Vikings built their legacy on a foundation of sexual terror that consumed everything they touched. Their story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones who attack from outside. They're the ones we become when we allow fear to transform love into warfare, intimacy into oppression, and human connection into weapons of mass destruction. Human sexuality, in all its complexity and vulnerability, remains one of our species' greatest gifts. The Vikings showed us what happens when that gift is corrupted into a curse. Their civilization died so that we might learn to choose differently. The question is, will we honor that sacrifice by protecting the freedoms they destroyed, or will we repeat their mistakes and face the same inevitable collapse? The choice, as it always has been, remains ours.